So our second panel features 3 cultural practitioners, community members, and heritage workers from Maui, Lānaʻi, and Molokai. And we are very excited to have them here today to share their experiences. Our first panelist is Kepā Maly. Kepā was reared on the islands of Oahu and Lānaʻi, and he was hānai by the Ka'opuiki Ohana on Lānaʻi as a teen, where he was immersed in Hawaiian cultural practices, languages, and values. Kepā's career has focused in the field of cultural and natural resources, ethnography, and the recording of Hawaiian history from Ni'ihau through Hawaii and beyond. For the past 4 decades, he and his wife Onauna have been documenting the stories of people, places, history of Hawaii. Our second panelist is Mikiala Pescaia. Mikiala has always worked to bridge information with people, places, and things to create a space for indigenous Leo Hawaii to be heard in all realms of government, education, and resource management. From creating programs for Bishop Museum's cultural collections to the Napua No'eau Center for Gifted and Talented Native Hawaiian Children, from Punana Leo o Molokai to Kali'i Mamo Video Production Academy, she has taught keiki to kupuna all kinds of things in a variety of programs. Currently, she serves as the Chief of Interpretation, Education, and volunteers at Kalaupapa National Historic Park. And she also serves on the Board of Directors for Kanaʻi as a chair of the Molokai Planning Commission and the Molokai Island Burial Council, and is a commissioner on the Kaho'olawe Island Reserve Commission. Mikiala has also served as executive director of Kaipumakani Cultural Heritage Center and as vice president of Molokai Makahiki. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts in Hawaiian Language in 2013 and is currently pursuing a Master's in Education and Curriculum Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our last panelist is Keola Donaghy. Keola is an assistant professor of music and faculty coordinator of both music studies and the Institute of Hawaiian Music at the University of Hawaii Maui College. He is a Nahoku Hano Hano award-winning producer and composer whose compositions have been recorded by artists such as Keli'i Raichel, Kenneth Makuakane, the Pandanus Club, Kainani Kahaunaele, Mailanima Kainain, Amy Hanaiali'i, and Billy K, as well as the Delima Ohana, Stephen Espanola, and others. Prior to joining UH Hilo, he was prior to joining Maui College, he was a faculty member at Kahakaʻula o Keʻeliko Lani College of Hawaiian Language at UH Hilo, where he led many technology-based initiatives, including Ulukau, the Hawaiian Digital Library. So aloha mai kako, and thank you all for joining us today. So what we have, so how we will do this is that I have a series of questions that we've sent in advance to our speakers. And so what we'll do is, in the order of the introduction, we'll go through the speakers, so Kepā, Mikiala, and Keola. And the first question is if you could tell us a little bit about yourselves, to introduce yourselves, and to tell us how you got into your current career path or what you do for a living. So Kepā.
Hi, aloha mai kako. Thank you for inviting us to share a little bit about Lānaʻi and for letting me join you. I've learned a lot today. It's been wonderful to hear. And Halena, I want to add one additional, because I think it ties to your overall discussion in the Olelo Noʻeau. Those are such important reminders of the Ike Kupuna. One of them, and in this field that we all are in at varying levels. By the way, I'm kindergarten compared to most all of you guys, because I'm grassroots, learn by doing, and hopefully not screwing up too much. But Kupuna taught us, Ikaloka ikoka ko'olai. This Olelo Noʻeau reminds us that our well-being, our ola, is in our unity, in working together, collaboration. And I've heard that theme discussion here. So I sort of fell into it by growing up. Tutu folks took pity on me, and I had the opportunity to learn from them, and it led me down paths that I think were able to bring us home to Lānaʻi, and we were able to build a pretty cool program, the Lānaʻi Culture and Heritage Center. And so I'd like to mahalo ke akua. I think it's mahalo I nā kupuna. That's how we ended up on this path. And it's not a job, yeah. Most of you, it's a way of life. Yeah, it's how we live. So that's a briefie.
Mahalo, Mikiala.
Velina mai kākou mai ke ahia ahuka pelili I keia kulama uma uo kalau papa. O Molokai nui ahina, Molokai no kaheke, Molokai aina momona, Molokai kuila au, Molokai o ka pule o pule no kākou I ke ola o kākou a pau oiai ke pilikia nei kākou me keia mai eia no launa kākou mau keia punai vele. Hevelina, mahalo for inviting me into this space. I'm born and raised Molokai. Many generations, my family actually comes from the north side of the island that is no longer inhabited with a community anyway, right now, from the Valley of Pelekunu. My Ohana is the first homesteaders in Ho'olehua and in Kalama'ula, when Hawaiian Homes first started. And so that's where my family continues to hana and ola. And so being raised by a family that is so connected to their aina, I've inherited the kuleana of stewarding the mo'olelo that comes with, and remembering who we are, who we were, so that I can make sure that my keiki, my community remembers who we are, who we were, so that we can move forward. Taking all that wisdom that has been collected and making really good use of it. And so recognizing that as a community, as a lahui, we are continuously evolving. We are not a dormant people locked in time behind glass walls and on shelves, but every day we are redefining who we are and who we want to be. And so it is an exciting time to be a part of that conversation, especially here in Kalaupapa, where, you know, there's a really rich history of people being here for 1,000 years. And then very quickly, politics, governance, and a pandemic of sorts and lots of other things come in and just kind of restructure our idea and perception of what community looks like, how we treat people, and it called into play everyone's ethics and values. And so when you merge those two things together, it has been my duty, my honor and privilege to come and be a part of the Kalaupapa story. The National Park has been here for 40 years at the invitation of the patients to curate that mo'olelo and to make sure that there is a voice for our local Molokai community as well. And how do we bring all of that together responsibly? And so I've taken it on as a challenge. I'm the first true interp staff this park has ever had, and yet we're a historical park. So I think that's kind of cool that they would trust someone who's from Molokai, who is connected to this mo'olelo and is going to take this kuleana very seriously. So that's kind of how I wound up here. Aloha.
Mahalo, ame Keola.
Wait, aloha pomeha na kākou. Can you hear me okay? All good. Well, first, mahalo for inviting me. I want to acknowledge first off, since there's so many unfamiliar names in this list, I am not Native Hawaiian. My ancestors were among the first settlers on Turtle Island, what is commonly called North America. My own parents relocating to Hawaii when I was about 10 years old, but became the hanai of a family from Lahaina, Filipino Hawaiian, who really immersed me in not so much the culture, but just the cultural elements that really sparked my interest in all things Hawaiian, including Olelo Hawaii, including the music and many other elements. But behind me is not Hana or any other remote valley. This is Glen Comkill in County Donegal, Ireland, the home of many of my ancestors. So I wanted to share that. Anyway, I first 10 years of my adult life were spent trying to find myself, and it wasn't until I married at the age of 28 and decided to get serious about my life that I decided to go to college and met a number of people who were foundational with the establishment of the immersion program here on Maui. Kiki Kawai Malia Male Mai Kahale Duklo led me into taking Hawaiian language classes with the goal of becoming an immersion teacher. Finished 2 years, headed off in 1994 to UH Hilo with that intent. And instead of 2 years of getting a BA and going back to Maui, I found myself there for 18 years, mostly working on technology programs, as Halena mentioned, Uluko being one, but also interfacing with Apple, Microsoft, Google, and other technology companies and trying to find ways to strengthen our ability to use Olelo Hawaii with the technology that we take for granted every day. And, you know, I'm really thrilled that we finally really reached the point where we can take for granted that we have these tools. We have the keyboards and fonts and everything else in our electronic devices so that we don't have to go to extraordinary measures in order to make it work for us. But in 2012, after finishing, I went to Aotearoa, University of Otago, to do my PhD in music. And after a stint there, I did returned home to UH Hilo and really had a longing to return to my first love, which was Hawaiian music, specifically the role and the primacy really of Olelo Hawaii to Hawaiian music. And fortunately, this wonderful program had been established on Maui called the Institute of Hawaiian Music, but it was in desperate need of help. The founding director was a busy working musician named George Kahumoku, who really couldn't be on campus 4 months, for, the 2 semesters of the year. He's traveling and touring and whatnot. So I was hired to come in and kind of firm up the academic base of the program. About 6 months after I arrived, he realized that he was eligible to retire from state government. So he left, and, really from that point, the program has become mine. With a lot of help, I've got some wonderful people that support our program. We received a Title III grant of $2.5 million about 4 years ago, which has built us a professional quality recording studio. We're able to create a lot of new curriculum, including online material for our students. We're teaching to the island of Molokai, and I'm in constant contact with my students because of our current situation. I don't know when we're going to be able to actually physically visit them again. I think we may have to sneak over by boat, but leaving that option open. But anyway, so in terms of one of the 3 pillars really of our program, one is academic excellence, and for that we really lean heavily on the expertise of our Hawaiian studies and Hawaiian language faculty at UH Hilo, Kalekoa Ka'eo Kahele Duklo, who's actually now our dean. Because to me, again, the Olelo is the foundation. Everything that makes Hawaiian music Hawaiian begins with Olelo. And the aspects of it, the melodies, the rhythms, all derive from the language. The second element is community service and support. So we do a lot of our work. A lot of our live performances are in support of social service agencies, groups like Novai Eha. So we include activism in it. The battle over water rights, most of our students have been very passionate about that, as they have been about the issue of Mauna Kea. So as community support, social activism is also a part of it. And then the third is our connection to our industry. So I've spent many years as I left this year, but as a governor of the Hawaii Academy of Recording Arts, which puts on the Nahoku Hanohano Awards every year, because we need that connection. And that's really one of the essential elements of this, is introducing the students to people who are professionals. You know, they've figured out a way to make a living through the recording industry. Now, obviously not any of them are making very much money right now. There's no gigs, they've completely dried up. But a lot of folks have gotten very innovative with doing home concerts and various things. And, you know, I think in the long term that may turn out to be a blessing, that we may find new avenues for them and for our students to be able to share their music, share their culture with the world. Because of what we're experiencing right now. Our one big tie-in with the museum world is with the Bailey House Museum in Wailuku. Through Uncle George, we connected, I'm sorry, I can't even remember who was the director at the time. It's now Sissy Lake Farm. So we have an arrangement where about quarterly, whenever the full moon occurs around Saturday, we have what we call Moonlight Melee. We come and provide the sound system for the performance. Our students have get the opportunity to perform again in front of a live audience, which is invaluable experience. Uncle George performs, and we usually invite another community artist, maybe somebody who's not a well-known musician, maybe doesn't have CDs out, but also give them the opportunity to get a little exposure. So it's a really great symbiotic relationship we have with them, and that, you know, the event brings people and helps increase awareness in the community of what the museum is doing, and also of what we're doing. You know, we've actually had students sign up for our program based on coming to the museum and watching our performances there. So with that, I think I will go quiet for a while and we can get to the next question or questions.
Absolutely. Before I ask the next question, I do want to encourage each of you, if you have a comment to share with one another as one is speaking, or a question for another, please feel free to do that. We're not limited to the previously circulated questions, so yeah. But for our next question, since Keola has jumped the gun a little bit, let's have Kepā and Mikiala talk a little bit more about their experiences and perhaps some of the programs and projects they have done where they've worked within museums or related institutions. So Kepā.
Mahalo. You know, so much of the history of museums, it's loaded with a lot of non-native bias or prejudice. Almost, I'll use the generous term of sort of unconscious bias or prejudice. And everything was stones, bones, some facets of material culture, and someone who was not a part of that culture being the translator of language, putting it into place. You know, this is what it's about. And well, we know more about this because we've studied it than anyone who's living today. Bad attitudes to have. And you know, we see that, and we see that there is a change occurring. For us on Lānaʻi, it's our work as a community organization, really grassroots organization, started first because the community wanted something that would help promote its history. It recognized that change was occurring quickly on island. But here's the interesting thing. Those who were most alarmist about the changes were those also who were tied to a period of history that spanned only from 1923 to the present day of a previous owner who took charge of Lānaʻi in 1985. And they were concerned that they were going to lose their plantation history, forgetting that there were 1,000 years of Native Hawaiian history, at least on Lānaʻi, prior to the plantation. And so we end up with things like Garden of the Gods, Shipwreck Beach, or Lanai. Makaolelo ko makopo ikupuna makela mokupuni o kalulao o Lānaʻi kapuana polore. Lānaʻi, not Lanai. Yeah, we're not Maui's back porch. And so just even trying to get people ma'a to that. So we engaged first, this is critical, and I know Tarisi and others, you folks spoke about it earlier, but this idea about engaging community. In Hawaiian, we might say to kuka, where we exchange these ideas and discussions back and forth. We learn about the things that are of value, but we can also acknowledge that in this day, and archaeologists will advocate strongly for this, well, you know, this is today, what do you know about 1,000 years ago? But in that Hawaiian mind and perspective, much of that is mai kahi piko, akahi piko, akahi piko. It's handed down from piko generation to generation. And while, as John Papai'i himself wrote in his series of articles in the 1860s, Nahuna no ka mo'olelo Hawaii. They are fragments and bits and pieces, but those fragments are treasures. And so what we did is we went into the community, we talked story with the broad cross section. Our eldest Hawaiian members, most of them the children or nieces of Tutu folks who raised me. They were born, the Tutu folks were born in 1890, 92. Their children were born 1913 to sort of 1925 period. So talking with guys who were in their 70s, 80s, 90s, living, the last elder native speaker of Hawaiian on Lānaʻi was 102 when she passed away in 2018. But we talk with them, we gather their information, their mana'o. Would you like to see something like this? Everyone uniformly wanted us to work for Lānaʻi to help to perpetuate knowledge of our past and how it enriches who we are today and our future. So lots of things, you know, to think about. And then this unconscious, if it is, I pray, unconscious bias and prejudice, you know, just getting away from the use of the words legends, myths, fables, fairy tales, and recognizing that in the Hawaiian mind, in the Hawaiian experience, mo'olelo are in fact those things that are the words that have been passed down over the multiple generations that connect us with the truths of life, the events in our history, and what makes Kanaka, Oiwi, what makes them native. So we're working towards, on Lānaʻi, towards shifting from that old school of all in a glass box, which means that, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go on to the education side for a moment. Not only has our museum system been antiquated by, and I can say this because I'm one of them, by usually a group of white people that often came from somewhere else and didn't have an appreciation for the depth and richness of culture, but and so they formulated their own ideas about what it meant to be Hawaiian. That it's okay in in a historic preservation review process to assess 1,000 sites in an area and say, well, you've got 1,000 of them, so we'll save one of them as a representative example. And sort of, you know, I won't get graphic about it, but screw the rest. Well, you know, who has the right to make those decisions? It really should be the native people that are rooted in place, connected, that kulaiwi, where their ancestors' bones come from. So one other part of this is in our education system, we also have like a 200-plus-year-old antiquated system of education that teaches you about Columbus sailing the ocean blue, Washington crossing the Potomac, you know, oh, there's a mountain in the Himalayas, you know, that it's the highest on earth, or, you know, what about, so what we've done is we've taken this cultural literacy or this competency. It takes time to build competency, but it starts with the first step. And for us on Lānaʻi, we've been working, we've got, and if you visit our museum's website, it's just simple, lanaichc.org. We've got this whole wonderful collection of histories from Kupuna and living curriculum that connects not just Hawaiians, but everybody. Because if we can get everybody on board and saying Lānaʻi and living it and recognizing that it's more than just, you know, in 1922, we became the pineapple kingdom of the world, you know, there's more to Lānaʻi than that. And so those are the kinds of programs that we're reaching out to, but we're taking it into the schools. We're taking it, but the real classroom is on our aina. Yeah. Now you go to Waiaʻopai, you go to Maunalei, you go to Kiahakavelo, to these storied places, and you learn, you have a connection to the past, yes? And maybe we even say a prayer and are invited to put a stone back in place so that, as Mikiala, you said, it's a living, viable culture. It's all hanakalima ai kawaha. And Halena, so true. You know, ho'oloi ka pepea, pa'akawaha, na nakamaka, yeah? And whatever, there's all, how two folks all said, yeah? It's so true. So anyway, that's a little bit of the work that we're doing on Lānaʻi. And I'd love to talk about the next thing about partnerships, but that's in our next question.
Mahalo, Mikiala.
Hi, mahalo. Oh man, I get like a million things I like say. I like respond like in real time to what he's saying. I kako. Okay, kala e na iho mai o ko I ka mana o ko inoa. Lānaʻi. Everybody say it. Say it properly. Man, okay. I don't even know where to start. I grew up listening to my tutu tell me stories. And I also grew up believing that my father was the smartest person in the whole wide world and he knew everything. And our education system is really designed to remove the authority in our families and shift that authority over information and knowledge to the classroom. And we, even today, we yield so much of that authority to things like cell phones and smartphones and Google for answers. And so I think even as institutions, museums have been afforded a place in our society to be an authority on information. And we're realizing now that there's a big shift where people are doing their own research and sort of contradicting some of the things that we've said or done and put out. And I realized that as a Lahui, as a community, we have yielded that authority over our own stories to someone else to tell. And we need to start reclaiming some of that. And when you think about just the Native Hawaiian population, the decimation and how quickly we shrank down for all the many reasons, right? So you got, I don't know, from just throwing out numbers, like from 1 million people down to maybe 200,000, down to 70,000. Okay, and then of those 70,000 people, how many actually wrote stuff down or told somebody? And you look at how much of our culture and history has really been preserved. It is really a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of what we knew when we were 1 million strong. So now we're all here in this day and age scrambling to try and interpret and reinterpret and pull upon all these threads that have survived in our own families, try to reconnect and interpret and make use of this information. So when we see all these collections, whether they're artifacts, material evidence, or their stories or photographs or whatever we have, I always ask a question like, what's the point of saving them? And as an institution, you have to be really honest with answering why. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Is it to make money? Is it because I care about how I'm interpreting it and I'm speaking as an institution? Or because I really want to help people remember who they were and who they are and who they can be? And through different administrations, that answer has evolved. And so sometimes we might have individual people working in these organizations that have a certain value set and conviction, but it doesn't go with, the administration or funders, or, people have different visions and motivations for doing what they do. One of the things that I love about Molokai is because we rarely let outsiders define that for us. We're pretty keen on focusing on ourselves. And there's a beautiful song, Kaulana Napua, that, says, "A'ole mako mina mina I ka pu'ukala o ke aupuni." We don't care about the money. We don't care about the fame. We don't care about the credit. There's a lot of things that we can live without. We are fine with our pohaku. We are fine with our aina. That's how we're going to survive. And so I realized that growing up on this beautiful island, and I say beautiful, not just in landscape, but for all the radical attributes that we have, like it has refined something, this aloha aina that is really hard to teach other people. And it's that common thread of aloha aina that helps us to when we have conversations, the framework of what is best for us, there's like this sort of a broader understanding or agreement of what is important to us as a community. I left Molokai. I was schooled up in Kepā Maly, and grew a very strong affection for our princess Pauahi. And very early in my career, I was still in college. I just stepped out of college, and I ended up working in the cultural collections at Bishop Museum at a very, very tumultuous time. It was right after the departure of the great Roger Rose. Really amazing work. And so the museum was in this sort of transition, and it was stepping into a space where I had just gone to school for, I don't know, 10 years, learning theory and then actually putting it into practice and seeing how other people interpreted 1.2 million objects and then tried to tell me my story. And there are some things that I could just, from a practical, someone who was raised, around certain things, walking into the collection, I'm like, that is not what that is. I know because my tutu get one, and that's just not, and maybe, okay, and, trying to lull me to that thought to go, okay, maybe that's what it is to you, or maybe to the people in Ka'u, but, that's not, okay, there's more than one answer. And so it really helped me to expand my, I guess, the realm of possibilities. And, because when we talk about a stone or a stick, I can do plenty. My stick can be 20 things this stick I can use this stick for. But I just started realizing, like, wow, how much mana is out there for people to shape us. And then how many people in my community are yielding their authority in their families and in their home communities and looking at these sources, looking at the books, looking at the paper, the exhibit, all of these things, and allowing that to define for them who they are. And I'll give you a good example, is that there are actually people on Molokai who don't realize that so much of what they do is Hawaiian, because they watch the OHA commercials and the Kamehameha Schools commercials. And, they see the people in Alo'i and they see the people dance on Mermonic stages. And okay, we don't get dressed up, we just get up and dance, or we just sing, but we don't look in the matching uniforms, and we as Uala lands, like we are way more Uala and open plains than we do Lo'i. So we don't relate to that part. So when we look at Hawaiian farming, like, we go, oh, I don't know, I know farm. I don't, they don't look at themselves, and I hate the word practitioner, but that's the word that we can all understand. Like, this is just our nohona, this is how we live. But too long has that been defined by outside sources. But then we come back as a community and ask, like, do we really care? Do we care what other people define us as? Is that important? And so that's kind of where my jumping off point of why I'm in this role at Kalaupapa is I have come to understand it is important, and I want to bridge that gap. And so for a lot of Molokaians, it's this, here we are, does it matter that the rest of the world knows who we are? Do we know who we are? Is that enough? So kind of a framework for moving on into the next conversation. Halena.
Oh, Mikiala, you're gonna make me I just want to reiterate something that she said that I think all of us can keep in mind as we continue the conversation. And this ties into what Kepā mentioned about, folks not necessarily having that deeper understanding, which within Helen's presentation talked about this deeper cultural kind of understanding that is not just what you see at the tip of the iceberg. There's all of these deep-rooted practices. And what Mikiala said resonates because essentially, oftentimes we find ourselves doing things that are quote unquote Hawaiian, but we don't think of it as such. And one of the things that I'm quite interested in is, when I think about curation and Hawaiian practices of care, the ways in which our kupuna or our tutus care for their objects, that's a cultural practice. That is a Hawaiian way of curating that they learned from their kupuna and their kupuna and their kupuna. But because of the ways in which we are told or we see what acting Hawaiian looks like, we don't think of those as those practices that have survived. And for me, it touches a heartstring, because my tutu is one of those tutus who didn't grow up speaking Olelo. She's 93. She heard her kupuna speaking, but that doesn't make her less Hawaiian. There's all of these other things that she does that are those ancestral practices. She knows Hawaiian words. She went out to the ranch and they gave lei to each other, and she can recount those stories, and that doesn't make her any less. But it's a part of understanding that there are all of these cultural practices that we do on an everyday basis that are rooted in a longer genealogy. So thank you so much for mentioning that. So exciting. So for the next question that we have, it's just kind of expand on this point on the projects that you focused on with museums. And the question is, why do you think museums and other related institutions, and when I say related institutions, I'm talking about historic sites, archaeological sites, cultural centers, art galleries, places that deal with the arts and with heritage and in culture. Why is it so important for these institutions to work with communities when they develop their programming or when they develop their exhibitions? So we'll start with Keola.
I was almost hoping for a little bit more time and the others to speak to ponder that a little bit more deeply, but I can really only speak toward the institution that, you know, we have our relationship with, you know, being Bailey House here. And I think from what I've observed under, you know, Sissy Farm Lake's leadership, they really do that. They're very engaged with the community. You know, there is a very Maui focus to everything that they do and the resources that they have. You know, connecting places here. You know, the importance of place. You know, myself, you know, growing up on the south side of the island, or South Shore, you know, what everyone calls Kihei, and then learning, you know, that entire side of the island was not Kihei. You know, there's multiple ahapua are running down that coast, and coming to the realization, you know, when I was in grade school, the post office was what the only area of that stretch that was known as Kihei. So it was the Kihei post office. Therefore, every place that it served got a Kihei address, and it really caused the loss of all the use of all those place names, and, you know, made me think how many other places, you know, our knowledge of the names of these places were lost to the U.S. Postal Service. But, you know, having that kind of local resource, I mean, Bishop Museum is obviously amazing for the breadth of its collection and what it does, but having smaller institutions like Bailey, where, you know, I could make a phone call and go and sit down and have a meeting with its director and access just about anything I need whenever I want is absolutely invaluable. And for them to reach out to us and you know, offer opportunities for my students to learn and for us to support their work. I mean, that, again, that's kind of symbiotic relationship that I think is really indicative of the culture. We're really, you know, supporting each other, and all, you know, not only us, but the overall community gains the benefit of that collaboration.
Mahalo. Kepā?
Yeah, important discussion. And I think it really starts with relevance, being, does your community, as Mikiala was alluding to too, you know, so what is the value in preserving these things? Well, if obviously each culture sees some value in it, but it's critical that we remain relevant. And thus, to do that, we need to engage our communities, learn from them, bring them in. Our little program will do sort of rotating community exhibits or special presentations, sharing multicultural, you know, not just Hawaiian, because our community is 68% Filipino. You know, we also have a growing Micronesian component, and there are, because the cultural values are very different, if we don't reach out, we will see difficulties arise. So I think a part of it is, you know, museums, if they remain isolated and don't work within their communities, their sustainability is limited. Their days are numbered. We already see that in, you know, I mean, not too long ago, I don't know where Bishop Museum is economically now, but they were struggling a few years ago after some debacles. And how do we fix that? I think that one of the great partnerships, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping around a teeny bit, but there are things that are sitting, say, at the State Museum of Hawaii, at Bishop Museum, that come from communities that have, they're just curiosities in storage at Bishop Museum. We should be able to take, and I think, Tarisi, that may have been some of the work that you did, that you shared during part of your video, is the idea of being able to return collections to communities so that and the communities need help to build appropriate facility resources. You know, it can't all be in a hale, you know, thatched and you know, out in the wide open. But so one of the great things that happened on Lānaʻi, and this actually occurred before we went home to Lānaʻi to build what is now the Lānaʻi Culture and Heritage Center, but it happened as a part of resort development. A collection of items gathered on Lānaʻi in the teens and 20s were returned to Lānaʻi for display in the resort, but they were in the conference room. The glass cases became coffee tables for people on break, you know, and they had little signs. And by the way, this idea about, you know, putting native names first, so critical. And so this was, you know, Hawaiian fishhook, forget the name, no more name at all for the Hawaiian side, you know, octopus lure, kukui lamp, you know. And so what we did is we extended that graciously. And at the time, and I know she's not there anymore, Betty Cam worked very closely with us to extend the this long-term gift back to Lānaʻi. So our collection, a good part of our collection, is actually from several, or Kauai Museum returned a bunch of material that was gathered sort of Indiana Jones style in the 50s and given to the Kauai Museum from Lānaʻi. And then of course there's the Monroe, Emery, Stokes et al. Collections that we have. But a critical part of this is, it's what about family institutions? And we may not call them, or corporations, but these families where Tutu or Papasan or Tata was out in the field, and they collected an adze, a poi pounder, an ulu maika, you know, so ko'iai. And what do we do with these things? Papa's gone, yeah? And so we've became that sort of partnership also of bringing things into the collections. So again, our collections span, you know, paper, photos, maps, material culture, but we also include, you know, whether it's a barong Tagalog or, you know, or a kimono or whatever it might be, you know. So those partnerships are really critical between community and other organizations. Sorry, Lava.
Hello.
We'll jump off from there. Oh my gosh. There have been instances at Bishop Museum where we have to address the struggle between preserving something so that we can replicate the mechanics and the material existence of that item or that object. Like, for example, ki'i, carvings. There are carvers who want to be able to have access to the collections to learn more about carving, so that they can continue that tradition. And then, but the carving itself served a purpose. After it was created, it had a kuleana and a mana. And by, we have ki'i now, so now we have this sort of conundrum between the people who maybe honor the entity who that image represents, wanting to see it being used, and the spirituality or the religious, role of these items, these objects. And there's been so many times where organizations, institutions have not facilitated those conversations in a healthy way. Because, and I don't even know if that's a kuleana, well, let me say this. The kuleana of deciding which one is more important or more valuable to a community should not rely with the organization. You need to continue to facilitate the conversation. And here in Kalaupapa, we do have, I guess, a similar conversation ongoing with the 8,000 patients that were sent here during the implementation of the law of separation, which, for those who may not be familiar, in 1866, Kamehameha V instituted a law saying that if you were found guilty of being infected with Hansen's disease or leprosy, you were to be removed and quarantined forcibly here on the peninsula. That was something that was necessary to keep the rest of the population safe. It took 103 years for us to find a cure and to get society back into a space where it was safe for those barriers to be removed. In that time, 8,000 people were sent here. Some were falsely accused. 8,000 people had a different story. Very unique story. Honoring 8,000 people's interpretation of a shared experience, like everyone is going through but the values that came with, we have people of pretty much every ethnicity, every religion, every socioeconomic background with one common thread. And now so we do have a museum and an archives collection. And then we have our cemeteries, which are like these curated spaces. And they're people, they're real people. And it's like, we're not so disconnected, like where we find an object and we're like, oh, we don't really know what the backstory is, so let's kind of just generalize. We have very specific information. And then we've got descendants and families who also bring into this space their own values of contemporary relevance today. The weighing in of what our patients, what their rights were back then, and then also moving what kind of into the 2020, if they were alive today, what would be their rights? Like back then, they didn't have HIPAA. They didn't have rules protecting their health information, or stuff like that. But we're affording them, with given our parameters today, some of that, some of those rights, and restoring some of those rights, and then looking at how was society structured back then that allowed certain things to happen. And here we are interpreting and trying to create access. Access, why? Maybe to reconcile families. Because there's a lot of stuff that went down that people don't understand. How, like, given our values today, how could they let that happen, Well, I don't know, you could look at 2020 and look at what our situation is today. How is some of this stuff happening now, right? So I guess nothing's changed in that sense. But I guess, I don't even know where I'm kind of going with this. It's kind of all kind of playing off of what Kepā was saying, is that our role in facilitating the conversation, sometimes we need to remove our own personal convictions from the conversation and really look at what the greater society's greater values and relevance, what is most meaningful today, and how do we allocate our resources? Because, like, as in the last 40 years, as patients were passing, their families want to preserve everything. Yeah, like And so they're bringing us, we had someone bring every box of everything that was in their tutu's house and say, here, save this. And we wish we had the resources to save everybody's everything. And it's making sure that as an institution, you have the right tools and the right policies in place that help you to be consistent. I think consistency is really important. If you're going to use this set of parameters to separate or sift through these things, you want people to feel like they're being treated the same way. And sometimes that's hard, especially when we're dealing with so many different cultures. And like Kepa was saying, it's beyond ethnicity. You know, we have a surfing culture, we have a farming culture, we have 80s pop music culture. I mean, there's all people got all kinds of values that resonate with them. And then we've got the you know, the assimilation. There's like all these mixtures. Yeah, we so bento out us guys. So anyways, with that said, I encourage you to pull together, when you put your advisory boards together, when you are engaging community, like really be thoughtful in who you bring into those spaces to reflect the broadest and most comprehensive view that you can. Oftentimes there's a very particular kind of person who's going to go into museum studies or into like, you got to love this stuff to get into it. And some, you know, I never grew up thinking I want to work in a museum when I get, you know, who does that? Very few kids do that because we're too busy living. We're just too busy like following our tutus around, and that we don't realize that there's going to come a point where we have to reflect and curate that part of ourselves. And so it tends to be yielded to someone else. So maybe there is space for more, I guess, I always look for opportunities to empower families to malama their own stories. How do you care for these objects so you don't have to bring them to us? And how do you decide, you know, and putting it back out into the community? And you look at every big act of war, people go and blow up the churches, the museums, like all the repositories of identity. They're the first things to go. And so I always think of like, if you only had all your one variety of kalo in one lo'i, and then the disease hit, then that one gone. Yeah, so you spread autohuli around so everybody gets, so if something happened, we still malama that variety someplace else, right? And so I think creating more spaces to put culture and make the connections back in homes, and exponentially I guess, magnify the mana that you have as an institution by empowering your whole community to be curators of that. Okay.
Mahalo. Thank you for your responses. Just a fun fact, because you was talking about like, we don't really necessarily think about what we're gonna be when we grow up. When I was in high school, they constantly pressured us, well, what are you gonna do with your life? You're going to have to go to college, and most people at that age don't know. And at some point in my life, surprisingly, I thought I wanted to be an astronomer. And I'm so glad that I did not go into that field, because you could imagine all of the interesting things that would have happened. But I enjoy working at the intersection of museums and community. So I'm very thankful to be here today.
When I was born, my tutu said, she gave me a name, Kanani o Napua, and it means the beauty of the flowers. And it doesn't mean that I was going to be beautiful. She said, you're going to grow up and be a teacher, and you're going to learn to bring out the beauty in other people and help them to realize their potential and their gifts. And she called it.
Nani no. Okay. So our next question, I think, ties in with a question that Faye has asked earlier, but I'd like to reframe Faye's question a little bit. So if you see in the chats, Faye has pointed out that 2 of our speakers aren't Native Hawaiian, but I'd like to kind of reorient this question so that all of the participants can respond. And it ties into our next question, which deals about how can we be better allies to practitioners. But the question that how I'm reframing it is the following. What are some of the roles and responsibilities of non-natives with an interest, passion, or upbringing within the Hawaiian culture? What is their place in the community or in working at that intersection with museums? And so I'm going with, I kind of keep track of like, to make sure everybody is like talking and having equal time or space. So it's back to you, Keola.
Well, you know, for me, it, you know, again, it started with music and, you know, playing gigs at hotels and clubs and whatnot here on Maui, and knowing, you know, in my heart that we weren't doing justice to the language. You know, we did what everyone else did in the 70s is, you know, you buy a record or you tape a song off of the radio and you just write out phonetically what you hear. And at the time I didn't, you know, I had not yet begun study of Olelo Hawaiʻi. And I just made a commitment, I'm going to get this right. And that led me into Olelo class, and again, meeting folks like Keiki Hokalani Holt here on Maui, who was the kahu of the Puna Naleo o Maui. And, you know, 3 months into Hawaiian 101, she asked if I would be interested in working at the school and working with the children. So I became a kumukokua at $7.25 an hour or something like that, and would go up to the school and work with the children for, you know, 2 hours or so before I went off to my real job. And, you know, to me, that was the best use of my time that I've ever made, the best investment of time in so much as learning the language, and again, being exposed more deeply to the cultural elements and what was being done with the Kaipuni program. But then, you know, it was really working the way up through the system. I mean, this was nearly 30 years ago now. So from that, I, you know, transferred to UH Hilo after 2 years of Olelo and was working in Halekumo'o and producing curriculum and, you know, doing the technology support, you know, really the grunt work that, you know, needed to be done. And that was, you know, my early career is, you know, what can I do with the skills that I have that contribute something to the overall goal of Eoloko Olelo Hawaiʻi. And everything that, you know, has come since then has really been that. And the only major change of direction was moving to Maui, you know, with the opportunity. But again, I was sought out for that. You know, I remember having a conversation with Hokulani. I mean, it's the thought of becoming an immersion teacher back when I started, I never really articulated it until, I forget, it was a family party or something. I mentioned, my wife was like, and when did this happen? But it just kind of, it was organic, it was spontaneous. And I asked Coco about it, and she just said, you know, Keola, you didn't pick this path, it picked you. You know, there was something that I had to offer, and a passion for what, an appreciation for, you know, I saw the effort that the immersion teachers, the earliest immersion teachers, were putting, all of the extra work that they had to do because they didn't have curriculum in Olelo Hawaiʻi. And how do I contribute to making that happen and making it easier for the next generation, which included my daughter. You know, she entered immersion in Hilo, you know, her Malia, and went, you know, preschool through 12th grade, you know, Mau ko Olelo Hawaiʻi na mea pau. So yeah, I think if you plan it, if you plot it, or you try to figure out, well, how am I going to make something? I'll give you a great example of my predecessor in music, not George, but the person who led the music department here on Maui. I had actually known him for many years before I even started this path. And he came to me grumbling one day and he says, you know, I talked to the Hawaiian, this is again, a non-Hawaiian Haole fellow. I don't understand, you know, I go to the Hawaiian Studies faculty and I gave them all these great ideas, and then, you know, they just don't want to have anything to do with it. And I said, Bob, you have no idea how brilliant these people are in what they do, and they have plans and goals. If you want to help You show up at the lo'i or you show up at the school and you get your hands in the dirt. They don't need your ideas. They need your back. They need your muscles, and they need, you know, whatever contribution they need you to make, not that you want to make. So I think that's really, you know, what it's been all about is, you know, how can I help? What can I contribute?
Mahalo. Kepa.
Yeah, you said it more eloquently, Keola, but I was going to start by saying, well, the first thing that I do because of who I am is you sit in the back. You don't just throw yourself up front. And going back, Halena, to, you know, pa'akawaha, ho'oloikapepeau, nanakamaka, hanakalima. These things are there. I've been blessed in my life to have very good teachers, a number of whom wrote the books that are most often used today. But when it deals with Hawaiian cultural matter or cultural competency, but it's all about your mannerism, I think, and your attitude. No one comes in, and sorry, I'm going to get a little graphic for a moment. You can bleep it if you need to, but you know, when I was in high school, this saying came out when someone sort of acted like this. They said, "What, you think you shit ice cream?" You know, the idea is none of us do. And in fact, as Keola, as you said, there's brilliant people that are oiwi, that have all these ideas. So what we do is we try to help along the way. If we can, we learn, we help, but I'm always going to be in the back of the room. I would not come out and say, oh, let me speak on your panel. If I was asked, if I felt that it would be worthy, I think we had the discussion, Halena, well, if you can't come up with someone better, you know, and you know, you just sort of come with that attitude of humility and aloha but we are, and you know, Keola, I think you hit it too on the head, this idea about, you know, I had Kupuna tell me, we're going to teach you because what your people took away, you can help give back. They said, your voice going to have mana, they will give it back. And I want to go back to something, Mikiala, what you were saying too, you know, and we were talking about these things that are important in our culture, our lives. But if you lose the language, and that was the greatest thing they did when they colonized, they didn't just begin stealing and robbing and pillaging, you know, the culture, the practices, like Teresi showed the ie, so we would ie kuku, you know, the kapa beaters, and about the prophecy that came from a Fijian there. They took these practices away. But the first thing they did, you know, was to begin to, or excuse me, the next thing they did that was so final was the stealing of the language. And we nearly lost, but fortunately, your kupuna were such prolific writers that, and there were those who were willing to share, you know. So backseat, we just, you know, do what we can. I have Hawaiian children. It sounds like Keola, you do. You know, one of my preeminent premier teachers was Tutu Kavena Pukui, and you know, I spent a day a week with her for quite a while and was so blessed, you know. But I can go to Papa Nui Kauhelauli of Ni'ihau, to Mahiula Hashimoto at Ha'inau, you know, as I said, the Tutuan Lānaʻi, Maui, Keola Hueu, incredible mana leo kupuna, Tutulilia Hale. These people shared because they wanted it to live. So we're going to share back, but we do it humbly and listening. So the question that Faye was asking, some of it has to do with just us being humble and being good listeners and offering to help when can. But kokua, as you said, kokua means more than help, yeah. It means to draw, to drag with your back. It's because you're investing in it, you're putting into it, yeah? So, lava.
Mahalo. Ame Mikiala.
Being pro-Hawaiian to me is not being anti anything else. There's a way to promote in Kākoʻo Hawaii without detracting or putting anybody else down. And so securing that space it comes with mana and it comes with kuleana. And my tutu, her name was Harriet Ne, beautiful, spunky woman. That's my tutu storyteller. She would drag us around and tell us all these mo'olelo. And it was just a given that we had to listen. And I lost her. I was a sophomore in high school. And it devastated me because I felt like I would never hear these beautiful mo'olelo anymore. And I cannot tell you how many people in my lifetime have come up to me and said, oh, you're a mo'opuna. She told me, and they would share with me these beautiful stories that I had never heard before. I've had mele, I've had hula come back to me, just amazing things that have pieced back my own history. And if she didn't trust these people with this mo'olelo, this information, it would have been lost to me. And a lot of those people are not Hawaiian. And so I very early have come to learn and appreciate that everyone has a role as long as you accept the kuleana, and I say the responsibility of whatever has been shared with you, of that ike. Whether it's stewardship of an object or stewardship of a mo'olelo, it comes with kuleana. Some people interpret that word to mean a right and an entitlement, but there's so much more to that. And it comes with the responsibility of knowing when and where is appropriate and what the kapu and the noa spaces, the restricted and the accessible spaces are for these things that you are entrusted with. And so as an organization, you know, it comes down to your own mission, what, you know, why you're doing what you're doing. And when you put together programming to create the space, right? All programming is about creating a space for objects, materials, collections, story, relevance, and an audience of some sort. To pull that together, if it is of a cultural nature or cultural significance, you need to have a voice present in that process that is going to take on the kuleana. Because, and so many times institutions, they do this and then it, you know, when there is a backlash of some sort or criticism that comes, we don't know how to handle it. And sometimes it's more beneficial to be proactive and creating that conversation space so that we know the why. And it's okay to not pursue certain ideas. Maybe it's not the right time, it's not the right space, it's not the right format. Little of that to, I mean, well, maybe I shouldn't say that. In that sense, what I'm saying is kuleana is kuleana. That doesn't matter if you're Hawaiian or not. I do appreciate people who yield the space, because we do have a lot of times people come in with a savior mentality. I'll give you an example, Molokai. When you look at our statistics, you can interpret it as like, oh, you got high unemployment rate, you guys have, you know, so many people on welfare, blah, 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 blah. And so they think that we're uneducated or we don't have opportunity. And so they'll come in with these programs to try and help us. But nobody stops and asks us why we're not working. And the reason why we're not working, very competent, brilliant, smart, able-bodied people are staying home because we don't have childcare and we don't have senior services. We have no care homes. We have to take care of our own kupuna and our own babies, and who's gonna administer medication safely and is going to, you know, talk on the phone and get, you know, get people to appointments and actually care and malama. It's an able-bodied adult. So our unemployment rate has nothing to do with us being uneducated or lack of opportunity. We have another need, but it's when these people who don't know us, you come into a community and think you have the answer. And so I think that was kind of what we've alluded to in our previous dialogue, is sometimes we're looking at things and interpreting it with our own lens instead of asking what you want, how can I help you? how can I help? And maybe sometimes it's being quiet and staying on the side, or sometimes when they get to know you, they'll realize what you can contribute, and when there's trust, we are more willing to take a risk and build that relationship. And that is super important, whether you're Hawaiian or not. We need to have trust in those spaces, because you're going to define to the world, to this audience, who someone is and what something is. Be accountable to wherever that conversation. Make sure you are completely accountable to the decisions you make in your programming and in your exhibits. Yeah.
Halena, can I share one last point? And I'm very involved with the group of Native American, Native Alaskan ethnomusicologists, and often have been asked to talk about this subject. And, I operated for a really long time, I would say, probably the first 12, 15 years, really in fear of, it's only going to take one mistake and I will be a non-entity in the community, and I'll never get another chance to make that up. And you know what? I've made mistakes, and I've been corrected, and I've been hugged and know not to make that mistake again. And I don't believe the way that my mistakes are handled, it didn't matter that I was Hawaiian or not. They would have done the same for someone of that. So, one thing I do regret is living in that state of fear and thinking, I'm one mistake and it's all over. But it's really, yeah, as Mikiala had said, it's what's in your heart, what's your, have you earned the trust, and to the point where people understand it was an honest mistake. You didn't do this out of spite or out of any ill intention, but you learn, you move on, and you do better next time.
Mahalo. I'd like to also add to this point, because it is one that is so important, because as Kepā has mentioned, and it can be extended today, a lot of folks who are in charge of these collections that are our Hawaiian belongings are headed by people who aren't Hawaiian. And so I would add that as a non-native person, if you are someone in a position of power or privilege within your institution or community, not only do you have that kuleana or responsibility of doing what you've been asked to do, but you also have a responsibility to think about, well, who is my successor going to be, and how can I get those people from the community, those kanaka, into these positions so that it's no longer someone from the outside telling the community what to do. I think succession planning is such an important part of the kind of work that we do. And we talk about it in nonprofits all the time, but I think there's an element of thinking about this idea within a genealogical sense, but also within a community-based sense, is that, how do we cultivate this i'ini or desire within those Kanaka students who want to do this, but might not necessarily have the support they need or the training that they need in order to take these positions and to feel confident to become the next alakai. So that's something that I'd like to add on that point. Very, very wonderful discussion.
Let me jump in real fast. So, when we talk about malama of different things, the structure, our historical structure with ali'i, or like people were assigned different kuleana, that kuleana was passed down through generations. You were trained from very young to do certain things that for us, it's the framework that we don't know our place. And I say we, as a Hawaiian, like moving into that space, like observing museum practices of care, who can touch something, when you can touch it. I remember when I was at the museum, I'm like, okay, anybody who is on their waimakalehua, like you cannot go in certain spaces, but your bosses are telling you this is, you have to do. So what that means is when you're on your menstruation, sorry, remember I have a bigger audience than just Halena's big face on my screen to get just talking to you. That we have kapu that we observe around certain things, and if you look at some of these items as just an item, disconnected from the mana implications, then that framework works for you. But for some of us, we actually leave and we take that mana with us. So I remember when I was at the museum, every morning I would make all my staff go out into the courtyard. We do all our protocol. We do our oli and our pule, and we make a commitment to move the work of the kupuna along and yield to their direction. At the end of the day, I make them all come back to the courtyard and we punny. You have to close off and like leave that work there, disconnect and go home and be you in your space. But making that commitment to the kupuna in their space, that if I'm going to come into your hale, I'm going to be interacting with you, then I'm going to work on your terms. And recognizing that a lot of museums don't have those kinds of protocols or those spaces. They don't know what to do with that. There's some things like we were watching conservators clean certain things, and I'm like, oh, there goes the mana. Like you're like, for some, the sweat, the dirt, the blood, the tears, the mo'olelo, that's like the mana of what that thing has been gone through, and the separate, in our mind, the value is in preservation. So we clean it and we care, and that's malama. We have a stone here on Molokai called Kalaino Vavai. It's a prophetic stone. Long story short, in 1909, Stokes convinced the ranch to hack it out. It was like a sandstone. There's a petroglyph in a sandstone. Hack it out and take it to the museum for preservation, because in their mind, that was the right thing to do. We're going to curate this powerful story. Well, 100 years later, we use NAGPRA to repatriate that stone back to Molokai. The only thing I think of at this time that was ever repatriated under cultural patrimony means not one person had the authority to give it away because it belonged to everyone, and brought our stone home. And the mana of bringing that stone home was so that our community could appreciate the mo'olelo of the prophecy that says, this is why the land has changed, this is why the springs have dried up, and this is how we're gonna make it. We're going to survive the era today. But the mana had to come back. And engaging the community in what does that look like? Because when it was carved, it was set in one context. And now how does it get evaluated into a space where it's powerful and meaningful now? And then to kind of go, we malama or you malama? Who is serving the mo'olelo and generating more mana with it in its stewardship? The museum or the community? And lucky for us, the Department of Interior sided with us, and we're able to get that back. Anyways, that's totally like left turn from where we was earlier, but I think that's an important point to make, is that sometimes as an institution, we actually serve the community better by entrusting them to malama. You got to know when you're not the right person for the job. And sometimes that's hard for us because we have good intentions, right? Like we want to care for something. But what does malama and care really look like? It can, sometimes it exists out beyond our reach.
Mahalo e Mikiala. So I'm aware that we have reached 4:50. I have 2 questions left, so I'll ask them. If there are no questions from our other panelists or our audience members, so if you have a question, I'd encourage you to share it with us now through the chat, or for our fellow panelists, as in you can unmute yourself and ask the question. But otherwise, I will share another question. I feel like I need to play like the Jeopardy little tune. Dun, 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 dun. I could actually play that on the ukulele, but I'd have to practice a little bit.
This is Helen. I have a question for Mikiala. You know, you have a very interesting dynamic with the museum down at Kalaupapa in that you have the patients still there. And often it's a real difficult, most places don't have that added layer. How has that impacted you, especially since you know, you did work at Bishop Museum and now where you didn't necessarily have that kind of interaction? How has that changed the dynamics for you?
That's a great question. So what she's sharing is that in our historical period, we had a number of patients, right? 8,000 patients in here. We still have about 9-10 of them who continue to call Kalaupapa home. They are, I mean, and very few historical parks have the main subject, you know, the main subjects living and breathing and ruling the space. And so that's for a long time they were against having an education interpretive person on staff because of that. They felt like that was their story to tell, and that the national park should not be telling the world what their experience was. And so when I came on board, there was a lot of resistance. One, because we had patients who owned tours, and they used to be the ones driving people around and sharing their story. And then as they got older, they hired drivers to do the tours for them. And so the park did a smart thing, I think. And what happens is I come in and I hang out and I go, "You think I can go tell the kids about the monk seal?" And they're like, "The monk seal?" I go, "Yeah, the monk seal." I go, "I don't care about the monk seal." I said, "Okay, I can tell the monk seal story to the kids." They go, yeah, go, you can tell them. "You think I can tell them about this plant? You think I can tell them about that hill? You think I can tell them?" And they go, yeah. And so to this day, as long as there's a patient here, I will always yield to them to be the first point of contact. Like, their story comes first. And if they yield that mana, then so be it. They are old. We're also very protective of them because they are older. They've been interviewed a zillion times, and a lot of their mo'olelo have been recorded and captured. And so now we refer to those resources so that we're not ho'oluhi. We don't, burden our kupuna, because they kind of just enjoy being kupuna. But where we move forward from here is going to be a very delicate conversation about who has the right and the responsibility to perpetuate these mo'olelo. And especially, like any community, sometimes you get contradictions of what version of the events, how you're going to interpret and, frame certain things. The National Park Service is moving towards something called audience-centered experiences, where we kind of shift the focus on, instead of us being an authority and putting out, this is the story, we're like, here are multiple stories, and what's your story, and how does your story fit into our story? And bringing everyone's, sort of validating your own ohana mo'olelo, your own experience, and finding a place for that in the conversation, so we can build dialogue instead of just gathering information like we used to in the way we interact. We have someone on staff. I think she is actually joining us on this webinar, Ka'ohulani Maguire, who is our point person. She acts as our liaison with our patient community. And so we take our relationship with them very seriously. We have a patient advisory council. They are consulted with everything, whether it's someone wanting to come in and do a video in Kalaupapa, you want to use, we run all our ideas and interactions of that nature by them, so that they understand and they have that mana to speak for themselves. They're still here. And that has taught us as a community what it's like to respect your kupuna and truly give them a place in your society and your community to have that authority. And so I do appreciate that structure here at our park. I know other parks do things differently with engaging their local community in making decisions and how they move forward on curating their spaces. And I'm just blessed that every day we continue to have our kupuna with us. You will never know everything about this place because we talk story with them all the time and they're always whipping out new stuff that just delights us and thrills us because we learn a little bit more of who we want to be.
Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Mikiala. You bring up a great point about stories in these interviews. The best stories don't really come out of the structured interview. It's when you're just hanging out and all of a sudden they tell you this story and you're like, what is going on? What just happened? That's how my tutu is. So it's always fun to hear those mo'olelo. We have 5 minutes left. So what I'll do is I'll end with a question. And you each can have about 1.5 minutes to respond. So we'll start with Kepa. But the question is, what kinds of changes would you like to see in our local institutions? And what does Hawaii's heritage sector look like in the future? And I know that's a lot to ask in 1.5 minutes, but you folks have the floor, so Kepa.
I'll be short. It will continue to grow from where we are today, from the foundation that you folks are discussing. It will become more integrated into the primary, culture of Hawaii. We can explore other people's cultures who are resident here in their places of origin. So let us focus and do well what we do here, that the succession becomes those who are rooted in that legacy of place. I think that's a part of the future. So sharing, continue to grow from here and having a succession that actually brings Hawaiians in as their storytellers.
Mahalo. And we'll go over to Keola.
Well, I think, yeah, as Kepa alluded to, the importance of these kinds of places grows, being involved with Ulukau from its very beginning when it started off on a spare computer running under my desk at Hilo to now, sitting in Google's cloud someplace. But I think, there may be now an overdependence on those resources. If you want to go into the newspapers, you can go into newpepa.org or Papakilo and access a great many of them, but it's still not everything. So unless you actually make the effort to go to places, and there's, books I know at Bailey House here that you're not going to find at the library, you're not going to find online, that very few people have ever bothered to go look for and delve into the knowledge that's contained there. So I think it's even more important that people realize, don't be over dependent on the net and stop your research there, but go to these places and engage the people who are those, have curated them and know the contents intimately in a way that a computer algorithm never will.
Mahalo. And Mikiala, you get the last word.
Oh, okay. I'm really worried about our institutions. A lot of us rely on our tourism and a lot of government assistance grants. A lot of our funding streams are really in jeopardy given this pandemic situation. And now is probably the time we need to really evaluate our audience and our intentions and how we're going to survive. And that right there in itself is going to take maybe consulting with people we've not consulted with in the past, and maybe coming up with creative ways to survive by recognizing your worth in your communities and maybe engaging your communities in different ways. And yeah, because people just aren't going to be coming through the doors. They're not going to be attending our events. And I know that sometimes just not having the audience kind of, it gets to us mentally and emotionally, and you know, kind of kill our fight, kill our spirit of like why we do what we do. So much of our bowl fills up when we get that interaction and that response and that appreciation from our community. And we're gonna be a vavi, it's gonna be a famine of such interactions coming up. So how do we continue to be relevant to our communities, be there for them in different ways? I hope that we can learn from one another and continue to have conversations like this that allow us to think outside of our normal routine and look at things in new lenses and different ways and try new strategies. And if anything, you know, how to malama until better times come along and we can restore ourselves into the place that, you know, we are valued and important in. Yeah, I appreciated this conversation very much. Mahalo, Halena.
Ai, mahalo ya oko pakahi paue Mikiala Keola me Kepā no keia ka'ana ana mai. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you everyone for joining us today.